Okay, in this one we're going to be talking about why you need to know about your historical documents and the true history of the U.S. First, we're going to add on the Patreon to the top of the chat. It's also in the bottom of the history as well. This is just for anybody who wants to donate, and it makes it a lot easier for them to kind of see the address. And it goes from $1 all the way up. Since I'm on disability, it really helps me to actually continue this, because I'm not really making any money currently with this, and through advertisements either. As you see on my regular videos, you're not going to see any advertisements, and it really makes it easier for me to distribute content to people at a much better rate for what they're going to see out there, because I don't have enough people to get the ads yet, because you need a lot more, because YouTube since YouTube changed their system. So I just use a Patreon to kind of basically have whatever people can donate, $1 all the way up to $100 a month, whatever they're willing to do that. That would help a great deal. Now with this, we're basically going with why do you need to know about historical documents, and going with the true history of the United States. Now this is something that's very, very important. This is something that goes into the idea of, we're going to discuss some of the points of why you need to know this, and it goes into the actual kind of, number one, the core of the site itself, or core of, I should say, the core of my podcast itself and live streams. And it goes into kind of where it goes into where you should understand something about politics itself. And it shows that basically you need to understand a lot about these documents, because we're talking, this is kind of where the nation was founded, and we're talking about the actual reasons why they left the actual system that they were in. Now, most people think it was just solely on taxation, or taxation with representation. That really was not the actual point. The point really boils down into the basic right you're going to see when you start to look at when you start to view the idea on the Fourth Amendment, and basically getting their house busted in by bulk warrants, and them getting all of their stuff searched. And that was really what it was going down to, and they had British soldiers searching their stuff for basically, because the British felt that they weren't being loyal to the actual British Empire, and the American people felt that that was a complete and utter violation. And you start to learn more about the actual history, you'll find when you look at some of the actual things, when you look at some of the actual bills, you'll find that why they were actually created is, it goes to a lot of different things and what people think they were for. Like the First Amendment, it doesn't say that there should be a separation of church and state. It never stated that. The actual point was on the First Amendment, when concerning religion, was basically that there was not going to be a state religion, and they weren't going to. It was basically there was not going to be a state religion, and that they were not going to block you for whatever religion that you wanted to practice, or lack thereof. That was basically the law. Now, it had nothing to do with religious symbols in public, or the government putting up religious symbols, or basically people being elected into public office that were religious themselves. None of that could be further from the truth. it was basically that none of these people were that basically nobody could make an actual state religion. It was not to be a theocracy, and that was the end of it. The idea of separation of church and state was essentially a bastardization of the First Amendment, and this was you'll find a lot of times where the people will try to create their own interpretation, and this is where we get to the idea of a living document. And the living document really came about through a lot of these started with the progressives, and then it started to continue a lot more when we get to the New Left. And the New Left came about through part of the 1960s and into the 1970s. And this is where we start to see things change. And you'll see a lot of judicial changes during these two periods, and that were considered as being anti-liberty during these periods, being the progressive era and being the era of this new left. And when you start to look at these, when we're looking at liberty, you will see that that's kind of an era that it was very, very destructive. And when we follow the actual meaning of what we want for what the founders were looking for, they were looking for none of the sort, because we need to follow the original intention of the Declaration of Independence, the actual listing on the Constitution. Now, the Constitution was actually meant as an actual rule book for the government. Now, that's the way it's supposed to be listed, and the Bill of Rights is not an actual list of rights, but rather a statement of how the government cannot abuse those rights. And that was specific to those points. And when we view that, you'll see that specifically. That when we view the Ninth Amendment, it does bring that point up, and that's something very, very specific. And when we start to view these things with it, now when we get to the 11th to the 27th, they tended to expand to being more with it, but it tended to be a little bit away from that rule book, but it still was a little away from that government rule book, but it still functions on the idea of the Constitution. Has always been this idea of the government rule book. If we even look at the actual Constitution itself, we'll actually see that it lists the actual functions of the government. Then when we look at the Bill of Rights, we'll see specific lists of what the government cannot do. And this is what the actual founders themselves had as intentions of what they were not allowed to do. And this is something that was very, very important. So when we start looking at those things, when we look at those things of the those implications on the documents, you need to also go a little beyond that. Now, there's also correspondences of different historic figures around those documents that need to be understood as well. And this will make you understand kind of what was going on. Now, what happened to create the country that we have today is a little bit different. And we need to understand that at certain times we have people that have basically tried to concentrate power into the executive and basically gotten lazy and allowed basically these situations to change to basically allow for such as in the legislative branch they've stated, okay, we're not going to do our job. So they've done things such as eliminate the idea of that coining of money, and they've basically stretched it to allow such, and they've allowed that to work out of the executive. Not only have they done that, but they've also changed that to allow for the printing of money. Now, the printing of money should be essentially viewed as counterfeit. It never allowed for the printing of money because it expressly states that all debts should be listed as all debts should be listed specifically to be paying in gold and silver for the states, which means this is a top currency, and this is something very, very specific. Now, when we find this, we're going to find something very, very poignant with these. With this, when we're talking about this, is that when we look at these, you're going to see that it follows a major idea, and it goes into the idea that we need to be looking at the history of how things are done. Now, when we look at the money, we need to understand that that is essentially then the government, though they are the government itself, they are essentially counterfeiting their own money. And that's because these we have these documents that is essentially they are breaking their own they are breaking this rule book, meaning it is unconstitutional. Now, because we have this, essentially what needs to be understood is that we are going down a path that is essentially the wrong path of what the government should be doing, because they're not following their own rules. Now, when we view this, is we see that certain people have stated that they want a Article 5 convention. Now, we'll discuss this later, but essentially an Article 5 convention says we're going to rewrite the Constitution. Well, our problem here is, as we discussed, they're not following the Constitution. And we have historical evidence that they're not doing it. They're essentially violating it. And then we look at history. It shows that the founders had set up this very, very simple rule book, which stated what not to do, what your powers were, what your powers weren't. It was a very, very short rule book. It was the shortest ever written and shortest that has ever been written to date. And you can look this up. This is actually a fact. And there have been ones written a lot longer, and they seem to be able to have an easy time following it. But when it comes to ours, they seem to have a very, very difficult time following it. When it comes down to it, is they seem to want to blame other things with it. Now, when we look at our economic system and the political system that we run under, is basically we have a for the economic system, we run under we were established under capitalism. Now, they couldn't get to that right. They had to go to crony capitalism with the progressive era, because they wanted to add a lot of these programs, because they're learning from, we had the progressives, they were essentially picking up things from the writers like Karl Marx, and they're adding a lot of these things in there, which is the same idea when Andrew Yang is coming around and stating that we need certain things to be capitalist, we need certain things to be socialist. Well, we've tried this for over 100 years. We tried this for, I believe it's minimum about 125 years so far. I believe that that's around what it's around at the number. So when people are stating that we need to try this, this would be irrational to state this because we've already tried it for over a century. Now, when people say we need to go to socialism, well, the fact is we've gone halfway there, and we've seen actual evidence which shows us that no, we do not need to go in that direction. What we need to do, and they claim that capitalism doesn't work. Well, when you haven't tried capitalism in over a century, frankly, you can't say capitalism doesn't work. What you need to do is you need to actually go back to it. This is why we have a look at historical documents. We know that in history that we have abandoned capitalism and as the pure capitalism that we would seek a long time ago. And this is the whole problem. We've put it under these regulations. Well, capitalism is not supposed to be regulated. This is the whole problem of what you have capitalism. Capitalism is not regulated. It's regulated by the free market itself. You don't tell people they have to sell to these certain people, or this person is this country you cannot sell to because we have sanctions on them. No, that's not how capitalism works. That's crony capitalism. This was put under the idea of people like Teddy Roosevelt, under Woodrow Wilson, under people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt. These are the people that put this system in, and because we have it, it killed actual real capitalism. Real capitalism allows you to freely trade with whoever you want, regardless of what the government wants to say. The government is basically going to get out of the way. And it doesn't state that, oh, we need all these regulations, oh, we need to force this on people, and putting the idea of a minimum wage instead of letting the actual people negotiate their wage that they're going to work for freely, and all these other things on there that are basically business regulations that force businesses out of functionality. And that's something that causes problems. Now, this is why we know that Marx was essentially just creating essentially the essentially a serfdom system that was basically all you're doing is changing from a king or a queen basically to essentially an elected leader. That's all you were doing, and that's pretty much the same thing, and there was really no difference. There's no difference from the idea of a bloodline to anything else, and that was pretty much what they were doing, was switching over, and that's what needs to be understood. And monarchy, going from a monarchy to claiming on the idea of democracy, is no difference. Serfdom is serfdom. And that's what's so the idea that claiming it was new is really quite laughable. Now we need to talk about the importance of the foreign policy, and this is why understanding some of the historical documents. Now, the founders themselves stated that we should not have entangling alliances. This means no allies. We should have 0 allies. And this is something that's many people today disagree with, because they go, oh no, we have to have allies out there because what are we going to do? Well, you're not going to be hostile to all countries out there. You're just not going to have allies. You're not going to have alliances with other countries around the globe, and those are basically what we call entangling alliances. Because the fact is when you do, when you have one ally, you're obviously anything in which that one ally has a conflict with, you're then going to be entangling yourself in a conflict. And this is where the problem comes, and this is why the U.S. did not believe in gathering allies from the aspect of the founders. And this is something that's a lot different than what we have now, because they essentially bastardized the term of common defense. Common defense was initially meant to refer to the states only in protecting the actual union itself. Now common defense is meant to mean the actual policing of the world and establishing the idea of NATO and establishing basically becoming allies with basically a lot of other countries just to basically harass a couple of enemies. And this is what we've done. So we've created a system to where we basically harass a couple of countries we don't like. This is mainly Russia and Iran. Russia, Iran, and Syria is basically what we're doing. We're basically spending all of our time, and now Venezuela. So we're basically spending our time harassing four countries. We've essentially tended to ease off of North Korea at this point, but currently we're harassing Russia, Iran, and Syria still at this point. And it's because of these entangling alliances with others that do not like them. And this is where we get to that point, and we're basically at a point where we don't like them because of that point. And this is why why our country's founders did not believe in these entangling alliances. And when we look at from the aspect of, for any foreign people who are watching this, it's basically from their aspect with it, they're going to not understand why we're harassing other countries. Well, the fact is it comes from the progressive era where they felt that we needed to be the policemen of the world. This is this foreign policy change from being non-interventionists, which went on the identity perspective of understanding that that people are free to have their own ideas, and ideas are the ones that change the world, to the function that of the liberal perspective, which is basically where we can go and intervene as an interventionist, and basically change any other country to whatever vision we have. And this is something that needs to be understood. And this is not just meaning liberal from the aspect of liberals are going to be the only ones that do this, because we have your Trotskyites, also known as neoconservatives, embrace this policy as well. And the fact is, you'll see this on both sides of the aisle. You'll see people from the left and people from the right that actually embrace this policy. And just within our alliance with Israel, you'll see that the fact is, you'll see that it's embraced from because we have this allyship with Israel and allyship with Saudi Arabia. It becomes embraced to where it becomes very destructive for the actual country to have these relationships, because they are non-productive and they have no legitimate value, and the only outcome is essentially more war. We see this, and basically these other countries, any type of conflict that they have, we end up getting thrusted into either A, financing it, or B, essentially having to send our people out there. And it basically gets us caught into a lot of different things, and it makes us look very, very bad. And this is the whole point. And this was not originally the intention of the country. The country is not supposed to have these, and essentially end up taking the fall for a lot of these other nations that we become alliances with for various reasons. Essentially, Israel tries to guilt us in it, and then takes a lot of money from us and then asks us to back them up whenever they get themselves into trouble. And this is what ends up happening. And they try to guilt us through, they'll use the excuse of the Holocaust, even though their actual foundation was essentially after World War I and due to the Treaty of Versailles. And this is why we need to understand the true history of the United States and the true history of the world. We would see that basically is their actual stories that they're trying to spit on people are complete hogwash. And that most of the people down there are actually not from any relation to the actual Holocaust, but actually people that came after, either A, well after, or B, people that were B, there well before, that came down there from the actual movement from the Treaty of Versailles on the establishment, or C, they were just naturally there previous to this point. And there's only a very, very small fraction of people that actually went after the Holocaust ended, because a lot of people either stayed in Europe, they went out to the Americas, they went out to South America, or they went out to East Asia. And you'll find the actual populations to be very, very high, because if it were the case that they went down there after the Holocaust, you would see the actual numbers of Jewish residents in Europe to be very, very low. If this were the case, you would see, especially around Germany and Poland, you would see exceptionally low Jewish residents, low numbers of Jewish residents there. They were there during the Holocaust period. You would see almost nothing there. And since this is not the case, you wouldn't. This is why you don't see that as a fact. When you see going out to, when you see the actions going out to other countries, and you see all these higher numbers of people, you would basically, such as in the Americas, you wouldn't have seen a high number of people entering the Americas because of it. And it's just a factor from what ended up happening. And a lot of these people that entered in there were not from that. And so what they were giving us with the sob story was essentially not legitimate. And this was a major point that needs to be made. So that what they were trying to do is essentially just trying to extort money and extort the alliance from the United States based on essentially a fraudulent story. And this is what you usually get. What a lot of people from those a lot of those areas from those that actually did leave with it, a lot of them did go into areas such as Russia. So our attacks on Russia essentially would be attacking these people who've been attacked, and they did leave there with it because there were certain areas of Russia that were essentially and Eastern Europe, they were essentially limited in their attacks on Jewish people that they could practice, and you will find pockets of them to this day, especially when you go to areas like Crimea. This is why there was a big split, because when there was the leadership change, that was being forced by by NATO, because they did not like the current Ukrainian leader that was friendly with Russia, and they wanted to get Ukraine into NATO. What they did, and they put in a new leader. Well, the new leader was a neo-Nazi, and because of that, the Jews felt uncomfortable, and they essentially did not like that in Crimea. So you essentially got the vote. And that was why the vote came through, because they did not take kindly to neo-Nazis being the head of Kiev, and that was going to be a huge breakdown. Now this is why we start to learn the actual real history of events. And when we look at another reason why we would not trust the story that's to blame it on the Holocaust, why we should support Israel, is because Hitler was a socialist. So essentially, the natural attitude of people would have been to essentially go against socialism. And this is something that is not normal for, would have not been normal for them to adopt a lot of their socialist ideas to for what actually got pushed into for what ended up getting pushed into a lot of the things on into what Israel does politically. And this is a thing where we see with what Israel does politically, and this is a major problem. And we see that they're very much into socialism currently, but they have other countries pay for it. And this is obviously this is an interesting tactic, but what they do is, but with this method is it's being a little bit out of the box from normal socialism. It still is a factor of them still being socialist, because there's, instead of them directly paying for it, they're putting a lot of the aid from other Western nations. It still is running the same types of programs. And when we look at what's these people from these Nazi countries came from, they came from socialist countries to begin with. So the theory that they were going to go from one socialist nation under Hitler to another one would have been insane. They would have essentially voted to end any type of socialism period, because they would have been fearful of it. And this is something that needs to be understood, and this is why a lot of them actually went to capitalism and went toward capitalist countries. And this is because they were fearful of repeating the whole thing again, because this was something that actually scared them of the actual things happening again. This is something that's why they a lot of them say never again, and they knew some of the actual reasons why it started. And this is something, when we look at the actual allyship of them, and we see that they're running essentially economically socialist programs, and you essentially making the Western nations pay for it, we could see that essentially the basis of their country would never have been made with people who essentially dealt with this. It would have been made with people who never had dealt with this. Even people like Milton Friedman tried to get them to switch over to capitalism, and the people had been slightly interested for a couple of years, but switched right back. And it shows an actual complete indifference to capitalism, and actually a huge interest in socialism. So it shows that there's some type of essentially difference between them and actually what was coming out of what would have came out from the horrors of the German Holocaust. So this is why when we get these stories, we need to understand what's really happening. We also need to analyze what type of stories that people explain in the backgrounds of some of these people. and what they're actually what they've actually have for their actual backgrounds of their reasons why they got to where they were, so we can actually understand, and we can see that essentially who they are with it. And it's basically, we need to get to that's how we actually learn about the actual history of where we're going. And when we start to understand on such things as like Bernie Sanders, you're going to understand that when it comes to his a lot of his votes, you're going to understand that he's basically just as aggressive on the war votes as a lot of other neoconservatives are. He just tends to do a lot of show votes, or a lot of, I should say, more like votes to kind of show that he's non-aggressive with it when it comes down to what ends up being votes that they don't really mean anything, and they just basically are there for public display. He knows that they'll probably get vetoed and these other things like that, so he can basically go to the so he can basically take that to the bank. He can basically go and see look at what I just did, and these don't actually mean anything. He will so it'll show where he's not consistent on that, and he can look like this peacemaker politician. And you'll find this with a lot of your socialists out there, and you'll find them to be more boastful than anything else. And when it comes down to things with it, is they'll be very, very willing to hand out weapons like it's nobody's business. But when it comes down to it, is when they have the cameras on them, they don't want people seeing that. And so when people are looking at that, they don't want people seeing that, because that's very, very bad for their brand. And they're more about the patronizing. And we saw that with we'll see that commonly with it where Wolf, like such as when Wolf Blitzer asked him about reparations, where he basically was dancing around the question and saying that he was for it, and then eventually saying he was for it. But then Wolf Blitzer brought up, well, in 2016 you said you're against it, and then he accused Wolf Blitzer of trying to be combative and trying to be controversial. Well, all Wolf Blitzer was trying to do was follow up on the question and saying, well, you're not being consistent. And this is something that's that we find with people like that. They won't be consistent because they're just going to pander to what the people want, because what it comes down to is socialism. You pander to what the people want, and eventually the people, when they get into power, in every single instance, the people get to see what socialism really is. It's government own the people. In what the founders essentially put through with it, and this is what you're going to read, is they did not want where the government had the power. It was based. This is why we established the idea of the Constitution being a rule book. And you're going to find out why with it when you actually read it. When you start to read the actual Constitution, you go section by section. I mean, you can complain about it being long, being somewhat long, but frankly, you're not going to find it as long as other documents that you're going to find with other countries, even if it's translated over for you. You can even add it with the Bill of Rights and the all other amendments. I mean, you could basically read it out and do an analysis on it within about 90 minutes. This is with analysis. You can actually go through on a video and do analysis, read it and do analysis within 90 minutes. and that's pretty quick. When you start to eliminate analysis, you could pretty much get rid of about 2/3 of that, and you could pretty much read out all of it within, I'd say, a half hour. I mean, and we're getting through all of it, and you could pretty much get through every bit of it within, and we're talking the Constitution itself and the Bill of Rights and the other amendments, and that's within a half hour, and that's if you're going slow. And that should give you an idea of where we're getting at. And this is why we look toward reading these documents, because the fact is it doesn't take long, and what you're going to learn from it is you're going to learn a lot more than you actually thought you're going to learn. And it's just something that doesn't take long. It's pretty easy, and you're probably going to learn a lot more and realize that what you're going to be learning is you're going to be learning stuff about the limitations on government that you probably didn't think that actually existed, and the actual rules specifically on government that you didn't think existed. I mean, specifically when you start to get out to like Section 8, you'll realize that, which is the getting over the idea, section of, Article 1, Section 8, you're going to see a lot of the things laid out for, like when you go Article 1, Section 8, and you're going to find out that that basically is, you're going to see that that basically is what's is where the actual Congress is actually doing things wrong, and essentially you're going to actually you're going to find out that that a lot of people have actually been doing things wrongly with it, and essentially you're going to see that it's going to be a lot different than what you would have initially thought. And you're going to see that really that's when you read it, it's going to essentially give you an idea of what the actual rules are of the actual government, and you're going to see that what the government has done throughout the years is not exactly constitutional, and it doesn't matter what they claim their lawyers can validate. When you see it's in plain English, it's not constitutional because it'll break it down by section. When you go to Section 1, it gives you the idea of what the Article 1 gives you the rule, gives you everything on the legislature. Article 2 gives you everything on the powers of the executive. Article 3 on the powers of the judicial. When it continues beyond that, that gives you additional points of the government, but which do apply with it. But when you're looking for the actual powers thereof that they have, you look to the first 3 articles. You look through the Bill of Rights, and those will essentially tell them what they do not have the power to do. And that's we continue to read there, and you'll continue with the additional amendments as well, which tell them what they do not have the power as well to do. And you're going to find very, very simply that that this is an actual rule book, and it's not hard to follow, and it really can be easy to do so, to follow. But the problem being is, when we talk about it, is most of them, number one, don't read it. Most of them haven't read it. And thirdly is, most of them, when they enter, had the idea of wanting to amend it even before they enter, which, when we actually look, they must take an oath to the Constitution, which means they need to faithfully execute, which means they should not enter on the basis of wanting to modify the Constitution whatsoever. Which means if they want to modify the Constitution, they should basically try to look to become an advocate for one of these groups. They should not be running for office, because you're supposed to faithfully execute. And you can listen to one of these advocacy groups as of reasons why to amend the Constitution, but you cannot enter on the basis of wanting to amend the Constitution. Because when we're talking about this, there's no legitimate reason to state that you're going to follow the Constitution and do that. Now, this is why we actually read these things. This is for people that are wanting to run. This is for people that are actual citizens. Citizens need to know about these things because they need to start learning how to vote. You need to vote for people who are actually going to be holding up the Constitution itself. This is very, very important. And most people don't understand this, when it comes down to it. When we talk about foreign policy, we need to understand it doesn't just go down to these couple of documents. We need to go to some of the correspondences before. And this is why we talk about no entangling alliances. And most people ignore a lot of these early documents that state this, and you can even see this in the way they reacted. They reacted in a way that they weren't essentially going to do any type of association other than diplomacy. And this is something very, very interesting that most people didn't understand. And they go, oh no, we have to have these alliances. Well, the fact is there was no UN. They would never have entered in such a group. There was no NATO. They would have essentially said we would never have entered into such a group because of what it entails. And they would have never entered into any type of alliance with any single nation, because they know that it could potentially lead them into conflict with another nation that they would never have conflict on, because the only type of conflict would be to defend their own nation, to defend the United States itself. And what this does for geopolitics is this: essentially, when we see this change, we see an actual change in the way we react with other nations, and it changed the way that we interact, and it changed it from being an actual non-interventionist that's only looks to act diplomatic with other nations, to a country that feels it needs to be the world's policeman and establish this global empire. Now, what would happen if we essentially reasserted our role with our original foreign policy? Well, this would essentially mean that all other nations would essentially have to do their own same thing. It would mean that we're going to pull 100% of foreign aid away. No more foreign aid would be applied anymore. The idea of U.S. aid would be shut down, and we would no longer apply foreign aid, and it would essentially restore us back to our original way that we would function. And it would be completely different from what we see ourselves today. Militarily wise, we would essentially probably be at about a third of the budget to retain maximum power, but while still defending our own nation. We would only have our defense at the nation itself, with our actual bases being built within the actual properties, territories of the United States, the lower 48, the other two states, plus other territories. And this would limit what we would be doing. Now all the nations would be on their own. Now they could deal with us diplomatically one-on-one, but that's a complete other different issue. And this would essentially scare off a lot of nations. And I think from what they would normally be dealing with, and they would have to say, okay, we need to stop dealing with things on a war scale. Now Israel would have to essentially state, we no longer can become the bullies of the Middle East. So would the same with Saudi Arabia, because essentially Saudi Arabia and UAE were essentially bankrolling theirs and Israel's defense. So what they would have to state is, we need to work out some type of peace deal, and it would with the other countries in the region, and they would know that they cannot do this anymore, because if you look at the conflict of the region, we can see that it has really stepped up. Well, first of all, it's actually really stepped up since the Treaty of Versailles, which actually carved up the Middle East because of fear, because of French and French and British fear of the Russians gaining influence of the region, but which ended up anti-Semitism of the British by sending the Eastern European Jews down to the Palestinian land and shipping the Palestinians out onto a barren desert. But it also, which ended up creating this problem. But what it would, but when you started to essentially start aiding these people, it even got even worse. So when we start looking at the conflict of the region between the wars with it, it still was not as great. So we would at least get to the point of between the world wars in the Middle East, which is still somewhat peaceful, and this is what we would actually get at, and just by backing off. And this is the point that we would probably get to by being essentially focusing on our own nation. Now it would probably be even better than that, because we would no longer be focusing on the idea of this liberal foreign policy, which it probably would even get even better than that, because you wouldn't have the problems that are going on in Europe. We wouldn't be essentially forcing a selected leader like we did in Iran at that point. There would not be the active caliphate as there was with there was in the case of, I believe it was the Ottoman Empire, still active. So when we're talking about that, is these things would have not been we wouldn't be we would have things similar to where they'd be a little bit normalized, and that's why what ends up occurring with it is when you go to a non-interventionist, you also have these benefits. And we can actually look at some history with it, is what happens when you don't actually actively try to do a great deal of interventionist campaigns to regions. What happens with terrorism, and we see that terrorism drops greatly. This is why there wasn't a massive terrorist threat earlier on, previous to the progressive era, and why there wasn't really the massive terrorist threat. And this is the sole reason. When we start to go back, we'll see that the terrorist threats earlier on were actually a lot less historically around the globe. As when the progressive era started to the common day, you'll see that they've actually popped up and been a lot greater because of that point. And we can actually look to that point to actually validate the non-interventionist foreign policy of the founders. And this is something that we see that's the more we bomb and the more we become more aggressive, the more terrorism pops up. And it becomes as a factor of blowback, not as a factor of just some crazy people deciding that they're going to start attacking out of nowhere. Yes, the Middle East needs to be viewed as kind of a hornet's nest, but it's not really a factor of what happens when we view the Middle East from an aspect of basically just a bunch of crazy people we need to intervene with. But the fact is, if we kind of take a back seat with it and say we're not going to be here, you're going to find out in the long run that basically the Middle East is basically can be dealt with by essentially saying we're not going to take part in this crazy town, and we're going to go to original foreign policy. And this is something where, as we go back with these historic documents and the actual far back history of the U.S., you're going to see that everything that the founders did was right, and you're going to see that they were right, and these modern analysts that of this stage, we need to be these global policemen, that we need to spend more money on public aid and foreign aid, and we need to go towards socialism. All these people are completely wrong. Doesn't matter if they're left or right. The neoconservatives are just as wrong as the people like AOC and Bernie. They're just as crazy. And this is why we need to view the founders to be a lot smarter than these people, because because the founders understood of what would go on and why we have a situation like that, and they knew a lot more. And that's why they were a lot brighter, and they actually looked things from what would be the best situation for the people, for their liberty, for their freedom, and for actually their security. And they understood that they needed to be guarded. They needed to basically have the option, if things got to be a tyranny, that they could basically have the same weapons as the government had. So if they became a tyranny, this is in the Declaration of Independence, that they could basically say, we're taking the government over. That's why they had the same ability to buy the 6-pound cannons. That's 6-pound ammunition, mind you. Which could basically take out a house, in nowadays terms, blow a hole right through a house. Or basically, if you're loading it through with a canister, you can load them with smaller balls. They could be as small as like 1 pound to from large as 1 pound to as small as, like, we're talking like as just a few ounces a piece, and basically take out like a bunch of people, because it's going to spray very much like a shotgun will. And this is the idea of why they put the Second Amendment in there. It's basically so they could essentially retake the government if need be. If the government got to be tyrannical and became essentially a serfdom. And then they also understood that foreign policy, we were not supposed to have entangling alliances. We were never supposed to have any of that. We were not supposed to be allied with any country. We were basically supposed to be our own independent country, making our own independent decisions. And this is something that when we're looking at it, we should be independent of every other nation. And when we start to look at ratings of some of these congressmen that do this, there's only a handful of people who have a 90+% rating in what can actually be considered as constitutional and follow the ideas of the founders. And if there's only a small number, that's not good. That shows that they're not doing their job. They're not even reading the Constitution. They don't actually know the history of the nation. That they're more interested in basically going to war and bombing people, or basically running up the debt on stupid things. When we want people out there, we want them screaming about the debt. We want them screaming about we want them screaming about the debt. We want them screaming about all of the foreign policy problems, and getting them back to being constitutional. And this is just very, very simple. And it doesn't take much of a genius to follow the Constitution, but apparently we can't even get people of basic intelligence, because New York was willing to vote for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who couldn't find her way out of a paper bag. I mean, she couldn't. She was looking for Mitch McConnell, and she was in the wrong building. So I think my statement on her not being able to find her way out of a paper bag is completely validated. And this is why the founders kind of understood that they're going to come out with other things and claim that they're new, such as what Karl Marx came out with his basically dictatorship serfdom called Marxism. Doesn't matter if we do it communism or socialism, whichever way you want to package it up. But he knew it was the same thing as the monarchy serfdom. And the only way to really get back to something realistic is pure capitalism, the laissez-faire capitalism as they dreamt of. That was actually what founded the nation. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell. Make sure that you share it all the way on social media. If you haven't seen already, make sure that you donate to the Patreon page right below. And make sure others see the Patreon, and that's about it. Bye, everyone. This is going to be my last one for the night, and that's it. Bye.